Hi, folks. Hi, Stuart Lockhead and Jimmy Hutton. I'm Norrie Stewart. Welcome to Hat Friday. We like to have one day a week where we wear hats or something, so we know what day of the week it is, because it's all beginning to blur a bit. Today, we're going to ignore the press conference with Nicola Sturgeon because it was incredibly boring, to be honest.
It was.
We're going to talk about talking heads, just like us. I suppose we're talking heads, aren't we? And how the narrative from the various talking heads affects what people are thinking. We're going to open up with the famous Rachel Reeves, who, if memory serves me well, when she stood for the leadership of the Labour Party, got a huge vote of 8%, something like that.
I think
anyway,
it was that.
She's back in favour with the media now that Starmer's back in place. So we're going to play you that, and then we'll have a chat about what she says and what other, as I say, talking heads have come up with during this coronavirus. Here we go. Rachel Reeves of the Labour Party. Don't get confused. She isn't actually a Tory. She just sounds like one.
The virus took hold in London earlier than in the rest of the country, but it has now spread out through all the regions and nations of the UK. I think as far as possible, it is important to have one nation response to this, because to have different advice and regulations in different parts of the country is incredibly difficult to enforce, but it also makes the communications challenge so much greater if the government are trying to communicate different messages to different parts of the country. And so I think as far as possible, it's important to have the same rules and clear message for all parts of the United Kingdom.
So there you are, lads.
I think they should just, based on that, if you agree with her, then the logical conclusion is they should just have a dictator, one person, making all the decisions.
Aye. It's kind of, it smacks of that stupid unionism where they seem to think that Scotland should just agree with all of England's decisions and go along with them because more people live in England. We're not a separate country at all. There are more of them than us, so we should just take a telling. I mean, try telling that to the 13 or 14 different Länder in Germany that all make their own decisions. There's a federal system there, but Angela Merkel's not making the decisions for everybody in Germany. They have local politicians making local decisions, and then certain national ones are agreed upon.
And not only that, Jimmy, there's a separate television service for every federal region, Länder in Germany. So like you've got, can you imagine having even just 4 separate television services in the UK, let alone?
Aye, well, that's how the UK is quite so easily manipulated, mate, because you've got the state broadcaster telling us what London thinks we should believe, and they pump it at us 24/7 these days. So,
well, you can't even ask a freedom of information question at the moment under these emergency rules. Apparently, they're not getting answers out of the UK government at all.
Well, plus the UK government is using the emergency legislation to pass without any sort of scrutiny. I mean, this latest announcement on Sunday by Boris Johnson before it went to Parliament. Now, it effectively means they can do what they want.
Yeah, I mean, the hint that's going on just now about that they're going to push through, whilst there's very little parliamentary scrutiny and certainly no real scrutiny from the country, that they're going to pass through this reduction in our farming standards to kind of sweeten the deal so that we get a decent trade deal with America. Outrageous.
That's worth noting. Not a single Scottish MP, Tory MP, voted for the amendment that would have allowed standards to be maintained.
Well, why do farmers still support this? Because their income's going to be ruined.
Well, this could devastate farming in the UK if we are opened up to the kind of competition that the Americans want. then farming could just finish in the UK.
Well, they're talking about introducing their cap system, which is to replace the EU subsidies in 2024. There's a 2-year gap where nobody knows what's going to be happening. So farmers could end up getting no subsidies. Now, a lot of farmers depend basically for food on their table on EU subsidies at the minute. That's going to cease. Aye, okay, food on the table, bad analogy. They've got plenty of land, they can grow their own food, but you know what I mean.
Aye, but mate,
a new Range
if you're
Rover?
a pig farmer and fancy a steak,
Aye, well,
can you go out and slice up one of your pigs?
but you can always bring can you afford to bring a cow on? We're kind of getting off the subject here. Jimmy, you mentioned Newsnight last night. I suppose at the moment, everything is a talking head because of lockdown. So they're all on their own screens.
Aye, but it was quite an interesting one last night because it was kind of Scotland-centric, the start of the programme.
First 10 minutes.
Aye, and you got Kirsty Work there interviewing Michelle Ballantyne. Fair play to her. She managed to string words together in what almost were sentences. So she's done all right for giving her past. Kirsty Work had to be reminded by Philippa Whitford at one point that she was making a point, or Kirsty Work was making the point, that devolution was seen to be working because Scotland were doing things differently, until Philippa gently pointed out to her, only to the extent that we can. For example, we may very well have closed our borders if we had the power to do it. We may very well have shut down our airports. We may very well have involved ourselves in EU procurement so that there were no pinch points in PPE, none of which we were allowed to do.
Philippa was really good.
She was, aye, and then we got the joys of the former First Minister, and I actually quite like wee Happy Jack McConnell. He's not a bad lad, but it would have been nice if Kirsty Work had pointed out that having Jack McConnell on the programme was a bit cheeky, given that they're bestie pals and kind of share family holidays together. So she was basically asking a mate on, and he got to speak last so that people remembered what Jack had to say. He
was actually all right. I mean, the question he was asked was about the communication between the devolved governments and Westminster government.
Aye, and he's actually got a point that at some point we should have set up a far better system of communication. He kind of excused himself a wee bit by saying you couldn't do that at the start, around about when he was floating about in the Scottish Parliament. But he's right, there isn't a good system. Yeah, and it has been shown, particularly in the last couple of weeks, that the system really doesn't work very well.
The point he didn't make was that the fact the system doesn't work very well suits Westminster fine. You put a kind of a structure in place that has to be followed, and that means you're going to have to speak to the devolved governments.
Well, Westminster didn't want that. No, absolutely not, mate. They didn't want a system in place that they have to adhere to, because that would even be admitting that Westminster doesn't have primacy over Holyrood.
Exactly.
Or Cardiff.
I think, look, you've got to. Yesterday, I went to the trouble of watching the Scottish Affairs Committee of the House of Commons, chaired by Pete Wishart. Yeah, what a big yawn. Right, but it was a Tories love-in. All right, it was all talking heads, all done on screens, but it worked quite well. There wasn't many snags. I watched an hour, a quarter of that. Oh, dear.
That was tiresome, wasn't it?
There was 5 Tories asking 2 Tory ministers, because the people being questioned were the Secretary of State for Scotland, who does nothing. He's just, he puts his finger into Scotland's affairs, even though he's got any responsibilities.
England.
And his deputy, the part-time football referee, they were answering the questions. The guys asking the questions were all Tories. There were, I think, 4 of them were actually Conservatives, and 2 of them were Labour Party Tories. So it was just so boring. But the worst bit of all was that Pete Wishart wasn't even running his own committee. he allowed Alistair Jack, the Secretary of State for Scotland, to decide. The only thing that Pete Wishart got to do was he said, "Oh, it's so and so next," and he obviously he got tilt. He would say it's Peter next, and then it's John after Peter. Okay, and then when it came to Peter next, oh no, it had changed. So somebody else was telling him in his ear, "Oh no, who's coming up next?"
The way he's always worked, I've watched him before. He's never abrasive. He's never aggressive. What Pete Wishart does is he'll ask quite a nice, easygoing question. Then he'll stick a stickier one in, then a stickier one still. I mean, I don't know how effective it really is.
Did you watch it?
Yeah. When he introduced it and he asked his first questions, he asked a couple of hard questions. But Alistair Jack is an affable, landed Tory. And he reacted the same way he would react to some local gamekeeper that was giving him a hard time because he ran over his dog.
Yeah, but can I just summarise? It seems to me, why on earth were they bothering, the SNP bothering being on that committee?
Oh, this is your bit about they should walk out. If they walk,
I think they should walk out.
If they walk out of committees, they've got to walk out of Westminster.
I mean, it was embarrassing to watch. I squirmed.
Well, Stuart, if they walk off that committee, they've got to walk out of Westminster.
At the very least, if you watch, especially Holyrood committees, at the very least, the convener will have a wingman. I don't know what you call a wingwoman. Would have somebody beside them to keep them right and perhaps ask harder questions. But what hard question did he ask?
Well, that's the problem. Not just with the committees at the moment, but with Parliament itself. I agree with the SNP's general premise that parliamentary scrutiny doesn't need them to be travelling down to London every week. But if we're honest, the committee's only working. That was awful yesterday. Stuart's right. There wasn't a single hard question asked. I switched off after about an hour because it was just doing my nutting.
I was about to say that I think one of the problems is that it is all done on the internet.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you kind of get told it
is much easier if the guy's sitting in front of you. You can get into it. And I think that is one of the drawbacks of the way it's been run at the moment.
And I think there's the problem with that Scottish Affairs Committee is there's going to be some serious stuff needs discussing fairly rapidly. And the way it's constituted with a Tory majority is going to mean that anything that committee, any findings that they come to are meaningless because people will just vote on parliamentary lines, on party lines. I think Stuart's right. The SNP should maybe just say, you know what, let's deconstitute. There's no bother having a Scottish committee. Well, anything Scottish can come before the entire House. We'll be outvoted anyway. We're going to be outvoted on the committee, but we can make a lot more noise on the floor of the House.
Committee reports are a bit more nuanced than that. If a report goes forward and, for instance, the chair disagrees with it, or you can actually take your name off it. So if some decisions are made on the Scottish Affairs Committee, it'll be fairly obvious if one side is all unionist and one side is all independent supporters.
Well, everything that this committee is going to come out with is going to be like that. And it has to be like that because everything that comes out of Edinburgh is, by definition, going to be the opposite of it. That's the only reason that committee's sitting. So Stuart's right in that regard. I think they should just say, you know what, let's not bother having a Scottish Affairs Committee at all. Do it on the House. Do it on the floor of the House in front of everyone.
Well, there's a question for you, Stuart. I didn't watch it all. My headache.
Neither did I. I waited till Alistair Jack left.
Well, if you watched, did anybody ask Alistair Jack why the advice for the lockdown was the British government advice, which applies to England, was the advice that was published on his website?
No.
Nobody brought that up.
I watched up to Deirdre Brock and then I done a bolt after that because
I watched him till he left. No, nobody asked him that.
How did Deirdre perform?
Toothless, mate. It was procedural questions and stuff like that. She didn't get torn about him, but I think, as I say, I think that's just part of the way that things are operating now. Where she also appeared on another committee about half an hour after that committee went off the air, international trade or something.
Yeah.
And the question she asked on that was much more biting, shall we say. Her performance in that was much firmer.
She's very good on detail.
I mean, I sent her a personal text after watching her performance on the Scottish Affairs one, and said, "I don't know. I think you should just pull out. I don't see the point of you being there."
I do think the tenor of it will change once everybody's sitting in the same room. I do think it's hard. Committee's going to be hard if you're actually going to have an argument with a minister about something. It's too easy when you're on camera.
Norrie, I'm seething at the principle of having a majority of Tory MPs on the Scottish Affairs Committee when there's only 7 of them in the whole of Scotland.
I'm sorry, Stuart. I'm sorry. There's an argument on the other side. The government of the day has a very big majority. You can't argue one way and not the other. You either accept that Westminster's democracy is in charge at Westminster.
That committee duty is not to hold the Scottish government to account. Holyrood that's the job, where the job is done.
Why are we even talking about holding the Scottish government to account? The job of that committee is to hold ministers to account. And the fact that the Tories have such a big majority is an argument for them having a majority on committee. That's democracy, unfortunately, but it is. And it doesn't matter in the UK Parliament what part of the UK they come from. It should, but it doesn't.
What about evil? English votes for English laws.
Well, what are you saying? Like that the SNP policy of not voting on English only subjects was wrong for years and years and years.
No.
But that's what evil is.
I'm just very frustrated seeing the makeup of that committee.
The only way that evil falls down is when you're voting on budgets because of the Barnett formula.
Yeah, but also I'm also angry that Pete Wishart bothered to even take it. I can see personally he almost certainly gets extra money and responsibility and all the rest of it, but on principle, I think he shouldn't. The SNP just shouldn't be there. I'm sorry.
You should have let the Scottish Affairs Committee be chaired by an English MP.
Yeah, it makes it farcical.
We just say that we have no interest in having a Scottish Affairs Committee because we have a Parliament up the road. Anything you want to send to Holyrood, we'll scrutinise, and then you can come up and sit in front of our Parliament and explain yourselves.
Well, it's like the tradition of having Scottish questions in the chamber before PMQs. You lose half the time with people moving in and out the chamber and talking to each other. So instead of it being, I think it's supposed to be half an hour, you get about 20 minutes at best.
Aye. And it's pretty crap for the 20 minutes as well, isn't it?
Aye, and they all interfere.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, guys, let's move off this.
Well, other talking heads of note that it seems to me that anyway that the old emails have been flying around for Conservative Central Office because John Lamont, Wee Mad Annie, Murdo the Turdo, they've all been having a wee whinge, and Jackson Carlo as well, all been having a wee whinge about Scottish SNP politicians politicking when they should be concentrating on sorting out coronavirus. They've got the cheek to be putting plans together to maybe introduce another independence referendum at some point. It's shocking, and the Tories are absolutely aghast at such totally disgusting behaviour. Meanwhile, in London, what's going on?
Well, never mind London, up here. The Tories have been politicking for the last 6 weeks.
No, Norrie. We're getting that wrong, Norrie. They're not politicking. They've said that they are willing to work in a spirit of cooperation with the SNP, and we're getting confused when the shit that they come out with and the crappy stories that they feed to the newspapers every day are seen as politicking, because it's not.
Right, lads, I'm going to have to play this for you. This is the Tories not politicking. Okay?
Okay.
Oh, wrong one. Sorry, guys.
We didn't want a Murdoch.
South, but the care home situation
The
right across the UK is arguably a national scandal. In Scotland, yes, but also in England and Wales.
Well, I mean, as a member of the Scottish Parliament, my focus is clearly on Scotland and ensuring that Scottish residents in care home receive the very best care and attention from the Scottish Government. And it's clear that on this point of safeguarding lives, there has been a failure. We haven't carried out enough tests, and that appears to be continuing to go on. And perhaps more worryingly is the SNP's animosity towards those private sector operators of care homes. You know, if you're a resident in a care home anywhere in Scotland, the Scottish Conservatives care about you and want to protect you.
Sorry, what animosity?
It doesn't matter whether it's a private provider.
What animosity? What animosity are you talking about?
Well, it appears as if the SNP have an animosity towards those private providers and aren't willing to work with them to provide the PPE
what's your evidence for that?
Testing that's required.
What's your evidence for that? I mean, we just heard Kate Forbes. I was asking her why the government doesn't intervene more in care homes. She wasn't showing animosity towards private care home providers.
Well, of course,
we'll leave it at that, I think, guys.
Well, I've got to tell you, mate, that's the second time or the third time now I've seen that clip, and how on earth that particular individual got himself into the Scottish Parliament. The vacant look in his eyes the minute he's actually asked a question. My God, there's nothing between them lugs bar fresh air, eh?
Look, at the moment, the only criticism, serious criticism about Scottish Government and care homes this week has been because of a BBC programme, which we discussed earlier in this week. And I noticed that the national newspaper have done a fact check over the question, could the Scottish Government have locked down earlier and prevented 2,000 deaths, which is what the accusation was. And that was what the whole programme said. And the answer is, so this won't take long. They did all the fact checking. They went for the evidence. They went to the IFS, the Institute of Fiscal Studies. Fact check rating, I'll show you what it says. False. It says here, fewer coronavirus deaths could have resulted from an earlier lockdown, but the fault lies squarely with Westminster.
And we all know, even if the Scottish Government had lockdown 2 weeks before the Westminster Government, the papers would have been up in arms. All this stuff we're hearing at the moment is SNP hate. It's all about finding something to beat Nicola Sturgeon with.
Well, I think hindsight, Norrie. They desperately need that story. What the BBC were hinting at in that story, of somehow that there was an SNP cover-up of what happened at that Nike conference. They desperately need that to stick, because if that sticks, it allows them to attack the government all about hindsight. But unfortunately for them, it's bounced off because it's a pile of nonsense, and now they're raging because they're desperate to attack Nicola Sturgeon and they can't find a way to attack her.
The only way allowing the public to know about the outbreak could have made any difference is if they published the names of everybody that was at the conference and their addresses and their itinerary for the next month.
We're not allowed to do that.
That's the only way people could have avoided them.
You can't do that. That's people's health.
I know, but instead what they did was what they could legally do, which was trace them.
Trace them all. Mm-hmm.
Which is how we know how many people there are. How did the BBC find out there were 25 people infected? Somebody must have gone out and found them.
Aye, they were traced, identified, and contacted.
Oh, I mean, their own information proves that the job was done properly. Maybe not perfectly, but properly.
And what wasn't done by the BBC when all those resources were devoted to that programme? What genuine problem did they not cover?
Tell us. There's
I
so
don't know,
much-
but I mean, it's like that police. What is it? 22 police involved in the Salmond affair. For how long and how much that cost?
Oh, if they lose in court with Craig Murray and is it Michael Hurst?
Mark Hurst,
Mark Hurst.
who's only just recently
call
left
that.
deployment of Sputnik.
Well, if they lose in court with those two, there is going to be hell to pay. There is going to have to be a public inquiry into that.
Well, that's why they're doing it, mate. There's a public inquiry coming up anyway, but that's why they're doing it, to try and stave it off. Clearly,
Wow.
whoever is in charge of the police operation and whoever is in charge of the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, they're desperate for any kind of conviction now. They will do anything. I'm tempted to say a couple of things out of turn and see if they turn up at my door. They're desperate to get any kind of conviction to justify what must be now at least a couple of million quid that they've spent on this whole thing, and they've got diddly squat to show for it.
I take it you've read the Craig Murray blog on it and what Michael Hurst is getting done for.
Yes, I did. I was disgusted, mate.
We could spend a day going through the papers and pick out 2 dozen articles could be considered threatening because they use, what was the actual phrase? What's he get done for?
Well, he talks about them reaping a whirlwind.
Right. Well, do you think that doesn't appear 3 or 4 times a day in the newspapers?
It appears in the front pages of the newspapers, the front headlines they threaten.
It's the way it's deliberately taken out of context. You can use language to say anything you bloody want. I could take Craig Murray's words and give me 5 minutes to jumble them about a bit, and I could make Craig Murray look like a bloody Nazi war criminal if I wanted to. It's not difficult, but that's what these people have done here. They've taken words and moved them around, deliberately taken them out of context to create something that just was not there. And I'm bloody sick and tired of it.
Well, if none of the mainstream media get pulled, if none of the journalists writing for the mainstream media get pulled for what they've said.
Well, I've got a question for both of you.
For the so-called amateurs and one for the professionals.
I've got a question for both of you. Are you surprised?
I'm surprised that I am actually.
Surprised I've got the balls to keep going through it, though.
And what does it tell us about the state of the country we live in?
It tells us it tells us we have unequal application of the law.
And unequal application of the law.
Well, that goes on all the time.
But particularly in this case, highly placed officials are now using police resources and the resources of the Procurator Fiscal Service to justify what more and more and more is becoming a personal witch hunt. And we need to find out how high this goes.
Well, it's yeah, you do, but it's harassment, and it also includes the treatment of Julian Assange. Don't forget, Craig Murray was going to be covering that, has been covering that trial as well.
Well, that could well be the whole package added up, but it's looking. I hope whoever they end up, because this is a judge's decision, it's not a jury trial. So I hope whoever they end up in front of.
Apparently, even, do you remember Ralph Nader?
Yeah.
That's a name that Norrie might remember. I doubt if you, Jimmy, would remember, because his name's not been a high-profile one for a very long time. He used to appear as a third contender to be president whenever they had their presidential elections in America. He's been, his name came up this week, and he's been speaking up for Julian Assange. I mean, basically, we have the country we live in using Soviet-type tactics against journalists.
At least they're not throwing them out.
Sorry, using Soviet tactics against journalists
trying to shut them up. Sending the police round to go through all their personal belongings, and yet all they've done is written something in the papers. No, this is a scary time. It's like a police state we're living in now.
I think what's apparent is the number of times that Craig Murray gets described not as an author. He's authored a lot of books, not as a journalist, but as a blogger. And that's the two-tier system that seems to be operating at the moment.
And don't forget, if he'd been in America, he would still be getting called Ambassador Murray.
If he'd been in America, he'd have been in the jail by now, mate.
Or shot.
Or shot. I
think it's quite, it's illuminating that none of these, I suppose I'll have to call them journalists, none of the journalists for the likes of BBC Scotland and what have you, have any interest in talking about that.
They've no
they
interest
don't
in
that
talking
story
about
at
it.
all.
They're not on their high horses about free speech either. And if Danny Garavelli does get pulled by the police, they'll be jumping up and down about freedom of speech.
Oh, absolutely.
And what's her husband's name, and what's his job?
Is he not on some sort of press?
He's the editor. Is he not the editor of one of the big newspapers?
I think.
Yeah, I don't.
Does he not sit on the press council? Does it?
Oh, certainly.
The ones that makes decisions about people being naughty in the press.
Yeah, basically, yes.
But
I mean, it's corruption. I'm sorry. I just cannot believe that this country has got this corrupt. It's never been perfect, but it's really got ridiculously corrupt.
I think it's time that people knew, for example, who is the Salmon team. If they're willing to describe themselves as the Salmon team when they go into the boys' house to arrest them, then who are they? What rank are they? Who's the boss of the Salmon team? And why are the Salmon team still constituted when the case has been over now for months?
I mean, if this was in America, they'd be getting doorstepped, wouldn't they, with TV?
There'd be a special investigator right up their arse right now, investigating everything that they've done and every penny they've spent for the last 2.5 years. Yeah. We've not got that kind of system in operation. But somebody should be checking what's going on.
Robin McAlpine wrote an interesting piece, not the piece we referred to earlier. And I suppose really what he's saying is that Scotland is a very small country. And that if you like, the political, journalistic, and capitalist elite of the country all know each other.
Mm-hmm.
So the jobs all interact, they all intermarry, they socialize, etc. The lobbying is done by people who have been in politics, etc., etc. The Charlotte Square crowd, and it's a problem in a small country, obviously, because there are fewer of these people, if you like, at the top. And we need to find a way to spread the responsibilities that tend to fall to this elite group through the community.
You're right, mate, because let's be clear, whoever these folk are, I'm not going to bump into them as I start about Edinburgh, but everybody, every single member of the new club will know who all these women were, the alphabet women during the Salmon case. They'll know all the names. They'll know who's doing the investigating. They'll know who in the Procurator, which is the one that I want to know, who in the Procurator Fiscal Service is driving it. How high does it go in that particular office? Because that office is meant to be apolitical, and it's clearly not.
That's the reason that if they don't pick up somebody and charge somebody on the unionist side of this, it's just going to look absolutely terrible. I mean, the idea that this is being used by a certain section of the SNP to pressure people who don't agree with them, I don't think is true. I do think that the SNP has been naive about this and allowed people to get into place who can pressure the whole movement.
I think you're probably right. But I think, as I say, I think what's going on at the top echelons of the police and at the top echelons, the Procurator Fiscal's office,
Crown Office,
it desperately needs desperately needs investigation. And there's no journalist out there in Scotland that I've come across that's willing to do that or has the resources to do that, which is bloody unfortunate.
Which is all the more reason that if you put pressure on the independent news media, especially the independent news media, the likes of Murray, etc., Wings, who's been pulled off Twitter after a pile on there, it is looking difficult. We may have to change our focus, chaps.
Aye.
Don't forget about the Twitter, the editor, the European editor of Twitter, who quite clearly has a large part in the decisions of who gets suspended from Twitter in this country. He's also a part-time soldier in the 77th Brigade of the British Army.
He's resigned from one of them.
It doesn't care. Once you're in that intelligence service, you never leave, according to James Bond, didn't it?
Well, I mean, I'm just saying, keeping people up to date because we don't want to give them dodgy information. I didn't say he'd resigned and not replaced himself with another member of the security services or Twitter or whatever, but he has apparently resigned. Having been outed by Craig Murray?
Didn't he out himself?
I think the first time I saw it was Craig Murray's ball, because he does have a bee in his bonnet about the 77 Brigade. Okay, guys, anything cheerful, seeing as it's Friday? Silence was the resounding answer.
No, it's not been the best of weeks, really, is it?
Nothing at all. Nothing, absolutely nothing. Oh, I know something to cheer us all up. Jackson Carlaw put his foot in it, did he not, James? Did he not tell a porky at Holyrood?
Oh well, that's just standard for the standard operating procedure for that fat fool, though, isn't it? He's been asking questions about hinting. In fact, no, he didn't. He asserted that more people, a higher proportion of deaths were happening in Scottish care homes than English ones, and then his figures were turned out this morning to be absolute horseshit, as it was pointed out to him. And I've asked him on Twitter, but clearly I'm not the kind of person that Jackson Carlow's actually going to respond to on Twitter. I'm just getting scrolled straight past.
That's my modus operandi with Carlo on Twitter, is to ask a polite question.
I tend to call him Jack or car crash, so I'm not getting answered at that point. It's not polite.
Well, I have to tell you, he's never ever answered me either.
Right.
But I bet he watches the show.
I'm sure he will, mate. Aye.
Okay, guys. Friday, I'll see you all in the pub, not later.
I'll walk past it.
You'll walk past and wave at an empty pub. Yeah, that'll be fun.
I'll walk past it.
It's getting, I must admit, this is the first week where I've kind of felt it a wee bit, the lockdown, that is. Okay, Stuart Lockhead, thank you. Jimmy Hutton, thank you. I'm Norrie Stewart. Thanks for listening, folks, or watching. And we'll have a day off tomorrow, I think. So we'll see you on Sunday after the mainstream media try to convince us that everything's all right with the world. Cheers for now.